While we were talking, Susan came up to me with a smile. "Actually, I've changed the land registered in your mother's name to mine." The land I inherited from my late husband was changed into Susan's name without my knowledge. Our relationship had always been strained, but I never imagined it would come to this. I turned to Michael for help, but he looked at me with a cold gaze and said this. "Thinking that you always bully Susan, I consider you the worst kind of mother. If you're really sorry, transfer the land to Susan and show your sincerity for the rest of your life." It seemed like the eldest son was on Susan's side, but I never intended to bully her. In fact, it might have been more common for me to be the one bullied. But in this situation, I didn't think anything I said would get through. I gave up on persuading and decided to leave, as Susan had said. "So you're saying I should leave? Aren't you going to cry?" No need to pretend to be strong. But who's really pretending to be strong here? After I leave, what will happen to them? They don't seem to realize it at all. My husband and I are both in our late 50s, and we have 2 sons. Both sons are married, have their own families, and live away from our home. So it's just the 2 of us living happily together. The place where we live as a couple is surrounded by a typical rural landscape. A car is necessary to get to the nearest station, and although there's a bus, it only runs twice an hour and not at all on Sundays and holidays. The town center only has a small liquor store that sells a bit of everything, masquerading as a convenience store. Michael never really liked this peaceful countryside life. In high school, he had wanted to attend a more bustling school but didn't have the grades. So he ended up going to a local agricultural school. After graduating from high school, Michael left home and built a new life in the city. He was enchanted by city life and married a wonderful woman he met there. He hardly ever returned home, choosing city life instead. Michael and his wife visited home a few times when they got married, but after that, there was hardly any contact, and they rarely visited. But as a family, there were times when it was necessary. As for family communications, it has been a tradition for daughters-in-law to keep in touch, even if there's usually little interaction. When I meet Susan, I usually travel to her, as she doesn't seem to like the countryside much. For instance, when I visited her, she would spray deodorizer on my coat, saying it smelled like the countryside. At first, I was a bit taken aback, but now I accept it as a minor issue. We were already estranged, and I didn't want to complicate things further by complaining. On the other hand, my younger son, Daniel, lives in a faraway land due to his job, in a town similar to the countryside where he grew up. Daniel travels by car with relative ease, often visits home, and cares deeply for us, his parents. Daniel's wife is a very attractive person, bright and friendly. We share common values, so my relationship with her is very good. Then one day, while still in our 50s, my husband suddenly passed away. I was engulfed in deep sorrow. My husband had hoped that if he passed away first, I wouldn't have to struggle and could enjoy the rest of my life. This land and house have been protected by my husband's ancestors. He said if managing it became difficult or it interfered with my life, I should prioritize my own life. In other words, I was free to use it as I wished after inheriting it. This land and house have traditionally been passed down to the eldest son. So my husband had discussed this with Michael. But Michael didn't like the countryside much, and neither did his wife, Susan. Inheriting land in the countryside is pointless. If it were prime city real estate, maybe, but not this. So Michael decided to make a different choice. Daniel also preferred a choice other than the land and house. He told me later that he thought it was best for me to inherit it, as this place was full of precious memories of my husband and me. As a result, it was ultimately decided that I would inherit the property. Daniel and his wife had considered moving back to live with me but abandoned the idea due to the burden of his commute. However, they warmly told me that they were prepared to move in with me at home if it ever became absolutely necessary in the future. I didn't want my sons' lives to be sacrificed for the sake of the land and house. When the time came, I resolved to make a courageous decision. Thus, it was decided that I would inherit the land and house, while Michael and Daniel would equally divide the remaining assets. The bond and consideration of our family supported this decision. Since my husband's death, development in the area had begun in earnest, and the value of the land had started to increase. Though I was now in my 60s, I still had the energy and capability to enjoy life in the countryside. People's opinions about the development varied, with some even moving deep into the mountains. Personally, I was looking forward to the convenience of having supermarkets nearby, which would mean less reliance on driving. This would be especially beneficial as I aged and considered surrendering my driver's license. Above all, it was a relief to me that the worry of Daniel and his wife about me would be lessened. At this time, I never imagined that my peaceful days would be disrupted by the unexpected actions of Susan. Amidst the development, rumors spread about an increase in the number of buses to the nearest station, and the construction of a high-rise apartment nearby. It was then that I received a call from Michael, who had been distant until now. I haven't been doing well in my job in the city, and I've ended up quitting. The idea of succeeding in the city was just a dream for someone born and raised in the countryside. I asked Michael directly what he wanted to say, urging him to come to the point in a somewhat stern tone. As a result, Michael expressed his desire to return to his childhood home and live with me. "Are you wishing to live together?" I asked. His response was affirmative, but I sensed hesitation in his words. Just a month ago, the family occasionally gathered. After 3 years passed since my husband's death. At that time, Michael was still complaining about the countryside atmosphere. I couldn't understand how he had changed his mind. During our conversation, Susan suddenly interjected. "You live in such a lovely place, mother-in-law. If only you had told us about the convenience of the developing land." Trees on the mountain were cut down, creating scenic spots. And I had heard rumors long before about a large shopping mall being built. Susan, who had previously thought of this area as just countryside, showed interest in the land as the development made it more livable. The land and house my husband left behind were in a very good location. Not just the house itself, but also the mountain behind it, which I inherited from my husband. That's when Susan asked, "I heard there might be land acquisitions due to the development. Are you planning to sell the mountain behind the house?" From her words, I could sense that Michael and Susan regretted undervaluing our land in the past, thinking it was just the countryside. Now, they seemed to hope for a share of the money if I sold the mountain. Oh dear, how awful of me. Mother-in-law, what I really wanted to talk about was my husband, not money. I honestly had my doubts about her words. The switch was too abrupt, and it felt like there was an ulterior motive. The situation was already complicated, and this only added to the confusion. To summarize, Michael had lost his job and was struggling financially, to the point of worrying about next month's rent. I inquired about the inheritance I had divided between Michael and Daniel, but Susan seemed reluctant to use that money. It's only been shortly after the 3rd anniversary of my husband's death, and Susan wanted to consider more about how to use the money. However, in their dire financial situation, I thought the money should be used for living expenses. But fearing accusations of being cold-hearted from Susan, I chose to remain silent. She tearfully explained that they couldn't afford the rent, gas, or electricity bills and pleaded for permission to live with me. I turned to Michael and asked him directly, "Do you really think life in the countryside suits you?" I found it hard to believe that the two, who were so fixated on city life before, could suddenly adapt to living in the countryside. I also asked Michael about his plans for re-employment. Are you planning to find a new job in the countryside, or are you looking for employment in the city? I thought he would be more suited to a job in the city. I couldn't understand why my city-living son, who disliked rural life, suddenly wanted to return to the countryside. However, as we talked, it became clear that he was struggling financially, having difficulty paying rent and depleting his savings. So, I set conditions for them to live with me. The cohabitation would be temporary, only until the eldest son found a new job. And I expected him to take on some work, like part-time jobs, during this period. With the ongoing development in the area, there were plenty of short-term jobs available. I thought they could save up some money and be ready to restart their lives after about 6 months of living together. I assumed that as a couple, they would work together to save money for a new beginning, including Susan working outside. However, once they moved in, things didn't go as I had expected with Susan. My son earnestly looked for a job during the day and worked as a security guard at a construction site in the evening. Ugh, how annoying. Shopping with an old pickup truck is just too tacky for me. I can't stand it. In this area, it's common to do a week's shopping all at once using a pickup truck. Susan had initially agreed to help, but after going shopping once, she refused to help again, finding the pickup truck embarrassing. When my son was around, Susan would compliment my cooking and ask me to teach her. But her attitude changed drastically when he was absent. She disliked country-style cooking and wanted to eat fancy dishes like French cuisine. She expressed no interest in mother's home cooking and sometimes skipped her turn to cook. One day, Susan said, "I'll cook dinner tonight." So I believed her and went to maintain the mountain behind our house. It's important to regularly check the mountain and request cutting to prevent overgrowth. Especially at the change of seasons and for fallen leaves, it's an important task. Since my husband passed away, I have been getting help from local young people. However, I couldn't always rely on others. So sometimes I would check the progress of the work myself. After walking around the mountain, I returned home exhausted in the evening to find the house dark, the front door locked, and myself unable to get in. I couldn't reach Susan on her mobile and was at a loss when Michael returned. While explaining the situation, Susan arrived. So I asked her why she had locked the door and where she had been. "How terrible of you. You asked me to go shopping. And then you forgot. Don't forget what you've asked me to do." She also told Michael that I had ordered her to make an impossible dish and threatened to kick her out if she didn't serve it. I had no recollection of saying such a thing and didn't even know she had been out. Yet, Michael believed Susan's story. Just because we're living here reluctantly doesn't mean you should bully my wife. She's not used to life in the countryside, and it's impossible to get ingredients for fancy dishes here. He accused me of harassing Susan by forcing her to do unreasonable shopping and strongly criticized me. Michael and I had always had different values and argued often. But I had never been unjustly blamed like this before. The person in front of me was indeed my son, but he felt like a stranger, which saddened me. It wasn't that I wanted my son to believe in me over his wife. A husband should support his wife to maintain a happy marriage. In fact, my late husband was always on my side. While my husband was alive, his involvement kept my relationship with Michael very good. But being unilaterally blamed and disbelieved, seeing him only siding with Susan like this was a very painful moment for me. Michael's words were a mix of anger and sorrow. "You can make and eat that fancy dish you like by yourself. I'm going out to eat with my wife." Saying this, he snatched the keys from Susan, threw them at me, and left. When I got back inside, Susan hadn't done any housework. The kitchen was left in the same messy state as when I left in the morning. I was so frustrated I could cry, but at the same time, I was too overwhelmed to do anything else, so I reluctantly finished the housework. A few days later, the owner of the restaurant where Michael had dined came to visit me. This place was the only diner in the area and a favorite spot for my family while my husband was alive. It was run by my husband's childhood friend, and he adored it. My son, Michael, knew this too. I was shocked and deeply saddened to hear from the owner that Michael and Susan had spoken ill of me there. After receiving this information from the owner, I decided to stop expecting anything from Susan. If my efforts couldn't reach her, there was no need to spend more time or energy on it. It seemed more rational to handle the household chores myself. As usual, I carried on with the chores, cooking, and laundry, responding calmly to Susan's behavior. Whether she took my kindness for granted or thought her plan was working, maintaining an unchanging guest-like attitude. Enduring this situation was difficult, but I remembered my husband's teachings and thought that patience was necessary to maintain family peace. One day, Susan's words left me in disbelief. "I'm in the process of changing the ownership of the land and house registered in your name to mine." Susan had already prepared the necessary documents and tried to show them to me, but she didn't clearly reveal the contents, leaving me full of anxiety and suspicion. The documents she presented didn't look authentic to me, who had repeatedly checked such documents with my husband. When I asked Susan if the documents were real, she became infuriated. "I'm going to be the master of this house from now on. If you don't want to be kicked out, show me an apology for bullying your daughter-in-law. How about continuing to live here as my exclusive maid? If not, feel free to leave." Her confident attitude made it seem like she believed the documents were legitimate. I asked Michael about this situation. "If you can't keep the promise of living together, shouldn't it be you who leaves?" However, Michael claimed I was the one who broke the promise first and accused me of being the worst mother. He confronted me with harsh words, cornering me. "Just because we clash and you hate me, there's no need to take it out on my wife and bully her. Isn't it shameful for a woman your age? You're the lowest of the low." It seemed that Susan had convinced my son, Michael, that I was harsh to her because I hated him. Knowing that our parent-child relationship was already complicated, she exploited it for her own benefit. Our relationship had always been complex, making it easy to worsen it. Exhausted from trying to persuade them, I remembered my husband's words. "All right. I'll accept everything you say. But I need a week to prepare." Initially reluctant, Susan eventually agreed, as did Michael. True to my word, I decided to leave the house a week later. Busy with moving preparations and procedures, the week flew by quickly. On the day of my departure, I left the house quietly. Susan threw provocative words at me, but I ignored them, silently rejoicing in my small victory, thinking this was just the beginning of my counterattack. I looked forward to what would happen in a month. A month later, I received a call from Susan. She was angry that her attempt to sell the land was refused as it was already in the process of being parceled out. "What did you do?" she complained in a shrill voice, laced with frustration. In fact, with the surrounding land development discussions, I had received an offer to sell the mountain and the land, but it required selling them as a set. Managing the mountain alone was difficult for me, so this offer was welcome. However, I hesitated due to my attachment to the house filled with memories of my husband. During this time, the aging issue of my house came to light. A relative in the construction field pointed out the house's aging during a visit to my husband's grave. The house, once home to 3 generations, felt too large and lonely to live alone. I began considering selling it eventually, as I doubted my sons would live there. The company interested in buying the mountain and land wasn't in a hurry as the area's development would take years. However, the start of my cohabitation with Susan had shifted my plans slightly. Without waiting for so long, I decided to let go of the house. The offer from the company to even cover the cost of demolishing the house and clearing the land was truly a blessing. I couldn't forgive the idea of the land I inherited from my husband being changed without my consent. Especially not with the fake contract that Susan had. I didn't want to give in to her or to Michael, who blindly followed his wife. I explained everything to my younger son, Daniel, and shared my decision with him. Daniel said he was sad that the house filled with memories would be gone. But memories are etched in the heart, not in things. Moreover, Daniel and his wife had invited me to live with them. They acknowledged my apprehension about leaving the familiar land but assured me that their place, also quite rural, would be to my liking. Grateful for their kindness, I am now enjoying living with them. I cut off Susan's verbal abuse and eventually blocked her calls. Then, one day, Michael found me at Daniel's house and came to ask for help, tearfully. At first, I thought of turning him away, but his words gradually revealed the truth. It all started with a notary public officer introduced by Susan's friend. Susan blindly believed her friend's words and thus trusted the notary public officer without any doubt. According to what she was told by this man, changing the land and house from my name to Susan's was possible by merely paying a gratuity. Furthermore, she was told that the gratuity would be less than half the market rate, and that she would eventually receive a large sum of money, making up for any shortfall from my husband's inheritance. She eagerly pursued the matter based on this explanation. Susan, trusting her friend, communicated with the notary public officer to proceed with changing the ownership of the land and house. Without doubting his words and trusting her friend implicitly, she paid the required gratuity without hesitation, and the documents were quickly prepared. Later, Susan explained the ownership change to Michael, who, exhausted, easily consented. Normally, the situation of a wife becoming the owner of her husband's family home while the husband is alive should have been strange. But Michael was deceived by Susan's explanation and agreed. At this point, Susan had already planned and started laying the groundwork to drive me out. She manipulated Michael, worsening our relationship, using the time he was busy with job hunting and part-time work. Gradually, Michael stopped believing me and became entirely under Susan's influence. However, Susan, who should have been progressing smoothly with her plan, hit an unexpected snag when trying to sell the house and land. It turned out that the land was already being parceled out, and changing the ownership was difficult. Susan tried to contact her friend and the notary public officer, but both were unreachable. Her calls were disconnected, and when she contacted the friend's parents, they rejected her, saying they had disowned a criminal and didn't know her whereabouts. Susan only then learned that her friend was a repeat offender of fraud. She found out that several former classmates had also been victims of her friend. The friend had been deceiving classmates by introducing fake lawyers, accountants, and notary public officers, earning commissions. The incident started when Susan consulted her friend about the land and was introduced to a fake notary public officer. Among the victims were those who filed police reports and others who resigned themselves to the loss. Michael and Susan considered filing a report due to the significant blow of losing money, the house, and the inheritance, but first needed to rectify their current situation. I suggested they rent an apartment since there might still be inheritance money left. However, Michael confessed that the cash card for that account had been swapped, and all the money was withdrawn. Michael explained that when Susan paid the additional fee for the document preparation with her friend, her PIN was likely stolen. The swapping of cards and other fraudulent activities are hard to detect when done by professionals. Susan, driven by greed, lacked caution. had shared information about the inheritance money with her friend. Despite receiving warnings of fraud from her alma mater, she ignored them, leading me to dismiss Michael and Susan as reaping what they sowed. Although the inheritance was gone, I asked if Michael had any savings from his part-time job. He confessed to spending it on drinks, having been persuaded by colleagues to go out, leaving him with no savings. As I distanced myself from Michael again, Daniel's wife returned home. She had started learning self-defense, and her assertive demeanor made Michael feel threatened enough to flee. Her timely arrival freed me from Michael's persistence. I expressed my gratitude to her. Later, I learned that Michael and Susan were working as live-in employees at the diner owned by my husband's childhood friend. However, they kept complaining about the low wages and were eventually asked to leave. Since then, no one has offered them any help. One day, a new house was built on the land where our family once lived. This triggered Susan, who then broke into the house and occupied it, claiming it as her own. Consequently, she was arrested by the police on the spot. When the police contacted me as a possible person to take responsibility for her, I refused. Afterward, Susan remained silent, insisting she would only speak once I arrived. Despite the police's request for my assistance in persuading her, I had no desire to help her. Even when I heard through the police that Michael was asking for help, I felt no sympathy and instead requested that Susan be sent to prison. When arrested, Susan claimed to be a victim of fraud. Her claim was believed due to several similar complaints being filed, but her own crimes still remained accusable. The friend and the fake notary public officer who committed the fraud remained at large, and the stolen money seemed unrecoverable. This event led to Michael's awakening. The couple divorced and began walking their separate paths. Michael appeared to be struggling financially and finding stable employment difficult. Meanwhile, the former Susan, tired of rural life, returned to the city and started working in a modest bar. However, she suddenly disappeared one day, and her whereabouts since then have remained a mystery. After the resolution of Michael and Susan's issues, I decided to continue living with Daniel and his wife. What started as a trial period turned out to be a harmonious and conflict-free cohabitation, filled with mutual respect and smooth communication. Daniel's wife, with her kind and gentle nature, was a perfect match for me. We shared similar tastes in food, exchanging recipes and enjoying our days together without unnecessary stress or strain. The neighbors often mistook Daniel's wife and me for a real mother and daughter due to our great relationship. Just as my husband had wished, I am enjoying the rest of my life with Daniel and his wife. While praying at my husband's grave, I whispered that I would have many stories to share when I joined him someday.